Hi, this is Patrick with Trusty Huckster Mercantile. I've got a different video for you tonight, actually a whole different background as well. I am responding to a video challenge and collaboration which has been established by My Blessed Nest. I'll have the link to her channel in the notes below. But My Blessed Nest has started a collaboration for I Love Thrifting. And similar to George's challenge last month from the Antique Nomad, where he asked us to hashtag show off your bunker, My Blessed Nest is asking us to talk a little bit more about how we actually got into thrifting. So where George's video request showcased our homes, our bunkers, where we were trapped during this pandemic, My Blessed Nest is getting more to the heart of the matter to find out, why do we like thrifting? And this video will hopefully address that. So thank you for joining me. My name is Patrick. I am with Trusty Huckster Mercantile. I happen to be a vintage reseller with a presence on Etsy as well as Instagram and Facebook. And of course, you found my YouTube channel. I recently discovered My Blessed Nest and found that I enjoyed a lot of the videos that she puts out, and really like the earnestness that she establishes these collaborations and how she participates in them herself. So when I heard the theme of this one, thought it sounded really interesting, and I wanted to showcase a kind of a specific area of thrifting that really is what kickstarted a lot of what I do and my love of thrifting, as well as I got into reselling, how I started my resale business. I do a lot of thrifting specifically for community theater. And in community theater is typically not paid. They typically have extremely tight budgets, and the casts are, although typically going to be taken care of by the production and by the theater, in some cases, if you have a lot of costumes, if you're in a show with a lot of props or a complicated set, money never goes far enough. I did my very first show a little over 4 years ago. It was a production of The Miracle Worker. I had a very small role. I requested a very small role because I was traveling for my job at the time. I was not doing any vintage reselling. It was something I was interested in. I was a collector, but not necessarily a thrifter. And I started in that production. It was a relatively large cast, a period piece, if you know Miracle Worker, 19th century. It was becoming a struggle to find period appropriate clothing for everyone in the cast. So I took it upon myself to rent my costume. And renting a costume for a 4-week production with a couple of weeks worth of dress rehearsals prior, I ended up spending well over $100 to rent a morning coat, a waistcoat, tie, a couple of the period pieces that I realized that was my first production. I could not continue doing that. And as I looked around at some of my fellow cast members, discovered that if they were not being outfitted by the theater, they were finding it through thrifting. And so that basically was my introduction to Goodwill, to Salvation Army, to a number of thrift stores, and the joys of thrifting, particularly finding specialized items, period pieces or period looking pieces on a budget for something like community theater. And the reason I am in my bedroom for this video this evening is because I am showcasing some of the costumes that I've thrifted over the years. Interestingly enough, I store all of my costumes and a lot of my props in this half steamer trunk, and this half steamer trunk made its first appearance in The Miracle Worker. It weighs a ton. Poor guy I did not have to, but somebody else had to haul this thing across the set. Felt sorry for him. It looked great, but it's pretty heavy, so I was not going to haul this downstairs where I normally record the videos. So you get a picture of my inner sanctum, and I've propped it open to showcase some of the costumes that I have. So after doing The Miracle Worker, the next show I went into, practically right on the tails of the first one, was a show called The Butler Did It. It was also a period piece, but instead of being from the 1880s, it was the 1980s. And that is a very common era to be able to thrift for in Goodwill. And I was able to find a series of costumes for a number of different costume changes that picking the right colors and picking the right combinations gave it a really 80s look. And the costume outfit that I've got for that, the goldenrod yellow polo, which of course I popped the collar, and the bright blue suspenders. So very 80s. This was something that I had a series of these. These happen to be the only pieces that I kept from that production, because as I continued to add to my collection, I discovered I was running out of room to store it. And pieces like this are relatively common in most thrift stores. So I decided that the pieces I was going to keep were going to be pieces that either had I had some special connection to, or I knew were going to be difficult to replace. Now, I don't really have a special connection to either one of these, so I'm not 100% sure why I kept them, but I did. So you got to see them today. After doing that next production, the Butler did it, I did another period piece. I was getting myself into a trend, doing shows back to back after having not done theater since high school. And I was in a World War I piece where I played a Scotsman in the trenches of World War I. I didn't have a lot of specifically vintage pieces for that production. The hat that I purchased was absolutely purchased from Amazon, total reproduction. But the one item that I did pick up was the pin. And so that is an item that I believe I purchased it from Etsy. It goes back about 4 years ago. It is a period appropriate insignia, military insignia for a Scots regiment. Put that on my hat. And I know it's not called a hat, but I cannot remember off the top of my head what it is called. And this is one of the pieces that I kept from that production. Admittedly, as I move forward, I'm going to lose track of the order I did some of the productions. So I'm just going to showcase some of the clothing that I have here on display. One of the pieces that I had thrifted is this. Effectively, it's a lady's scarf. It's blue. It's got browns and greens in it. This actually graced my neck as an ascot for Little Women, the musical version in which I played Professor Bear. So there were several pieces of my personal collection that appeared in that production. This trunk made an appearance as well, and also some individual props pieces that I rated my personal living room for, because my living room is decorated in a mid-19th century, fairly traditional appearance. So I had some of those pieces, and then several additional items of clothing, including these boots, which have since taken a lot of wear and tear. But these boots were a great find and have graced the stage in a number of different productions. Since I talked about the boots, I'll go ahead and say these did show up in other productions, and another production where I was doing another period piece. We do see a theme. I was the narrator in A Tale of Two Cities. And the footwear was a very significant problem for that production. It was a very large cast. The stage was very small, and it was very close to the audience. It was a 3/4 thrust stage, if you're familiar with theater parlance. And so we were going to effectively be inches from the audience. And it was difficult to find 18th century footwear that seemed somewhat appropriate. So these ended up gracing my character, and I had another pair that I wore in my day-to-day work appearance, another pair that was very similar to it, but not in as rough of condition. I loaned those to another actor so that he could have boots that looked like this. And in the end, we ended up having a pretty good-looking production with some pretty attractive costumes. But these boots are probably one of my favorite costume pieces, and I do wear them as often as I can in period pieces. I don't know if this would count as thrifting or if it more counts as theft. So I did a production that was a murder mystery for a local community theater. It was one of their fundraisers, and the general theme behind the show was kind of a spoof on Gone with the Wind, the show Dallas. It was somewhat odd, but I played a character known as Rhett. Sugar Baker, I think, was my last name, although now I can't remember. It's been a while. But anyway, because it was a fundraiser, there was no money being allocated for costumes or for props or for anything that we needed. We all needed to do it on our own. And so a buddy of mine had a hat collection. He also runs a vintage pen business. I'll put a link to him below. Wouldn't have to hurt to give him a shout out since I stole his hat. But he ended up loaning me this hat. He said he didn't wear it very often. You know, most people outside Chicago do not need to wear cowboy hats. But it fit my character perfectly. And along with it, because of the era and the type of character I had, I added this leather accented t-shirt, which was skin tight on me, and I do not have a body figure for anything to be skin tight, but and then with a blazer over it. All of these things were thrifted. This effectively became stolen because I didn't get it back to him after that production, and he has since moved to another state. So I do hold on to it. It's getting a little dusty. Sorry, Nathaniel. But I've got a cowboy hat, and I didn't pay for it. So not cowboy boots necessarily, although they're kind of cowboy boots. This is probably one of my favorite costume pieces that I acquired indirectly. This was from a production I did of Death Trap. If you're familiar with the film, you would think someone my age would have played the Michael Caine role. You would be mistaken. I actually played the Christopher Reeve role, and I had to darken my beard to the point where it was basically jet black. I lost a lot of weight, some of which I put back on, and tried to act like someone in my 20s. And it ended up being one of the most fun roles I ever did. And because the show takes place in the 70s, some of the costumes were really fun to thrift. And it happened to be at a theater that had a very large costume department that we were able to pull from. And these boots actually existed within their collection. They had not been used, according to the costumer, in years, if not decades, and they fit me perfectly. So I ended up doing a weird kind of trade that a lot of people don't even realize I did. I kind of kept it under the rug, and here it's all coming out. But I did a lot of the set dressing for that production as well. And one of the pieces that I picked up was a 1978 style huge coffee table, which fit the theme and the set that we were using. I ended up picking that up from a Goodwill, so I did thrift it. I then donated it to the theater in exchange for these boots. They've been on me for Halloween costumes. I wore these to work one day. People really didn't know what to say. But they're fun. They still have remnants of a little bit of the blood where I was killed, spoiler alert, in Death Trap. But that just makes them even more fun for me to use. So these are my Dingo Boots that I just love to have. Most of the acting that I have done has been on stage. Most of it for community theater, most of it volunteer. I've been paid a little bit. Typically what I got paid barely covered the drinks that we spent at the bar after the theater. But I did actually dabble into movies, and I did 2 independent films. And this trench coat I thrifted at a Goodwill showed up in my very first film. It was an interesting film. It was an interesting process. I'd never been involved in a film before. Wasn't particularly a movie buff to the point that I was even 100% clear what all of the terms meant for these people that I was meeting on set. But regardless, I needed to costume myself. It was a low-budget independent film. So I ended up bringing all my costumes, which had gotten director approval. And this was one of the pieces that we decided to use in one of the pivotal moments of the movie, at which time I stood outside, and this is not hyperbolic. I realize I can get carried away sometimes, but this really happened. At 2 o'clock in the morning, in the parking lot of an Office Depot in suburban Chicago, I am wielding what effectively is a real gun. It holds blanks and it has been modified, so at no point could it ever take real bullets again. But it started life as a real firearm. I am holding it to the head of a girl, and we are filming it. And I kept waiting for the cops to show up. But regardless, this was what I wore in that scene. It was, again, no exaggeration, over 90 degrees at 2 o'clock in the morning, over 90% humidity, because this was the dead of summer in suburban Chicago. And I was wearing a trench coat. Why? I'm not really sure, but it fit my character, I guess. And it made me look even worse than normal because I was sweating disproportionately because of this. So it really fit the craziness of my character as I attacked poor Lindsay with a gun. She did not like doing that scene. So that was my trench coat. Admittedly, one of the things that I have in my collection probably doesn't technically fall under the thrifting category because these items themselves were not thrifted, but I show them here because it actually kind of gets into the love of thrifting, but also the need for thrifting. If you are doing community theater or if you're doing a film, in some cases you need pieces that need to be able to be reused every night. And in a production of Noises Off, if you're familiar with the show, I spent a good chunk of the show wearing this Hawaiian shirt. However, in Act 3, I quote-unquote fall down the stairs, and when I come back on stage, my shirt is torn, my pants are bloody, I have a bloody nose, I have a bandaged head. So at some point, I have to go from backstage from a perfectly fine and presentable, although right now it's not ironed, but it was ironed for the production, a nice looking, Hawaiian shirt for my character, to a shirt that was completely destroyed. So these items were not vintage, but we had to buy 2 identical versions so that we could have one torn up, and the next night I could go back to the clean one. But what was thrifted was the pants. I don't actually have them anymore because they were simply a light khaki colored men's pant. They were not the same brand. They were not the exact same look. They were nothing. They had nothing to do with each other except they were basically the same color. And when you're on stage, depending on the stage, that particular one, the front row of the audience was at least 20 feet away. They were close enough that you could thrift 2 pairs of pants that did not identically match, and you could have one that stayed clean and one that you could destroy. And the audience is right there with you, suspending their disbelief, but you can get some great items at a thrift store at an inexpensive price to be able to provide that level of suspension of disbelief in a more believable way. This has probably got to become one of my favorite. I just listed a bunch of favorites, didn't I? Well, this is another one. Maybe this is my favorite vest. And trust me, if you followed my theater career, I wear vests a lot. I like them. They help suck in my stomach. And they just look good on stage. And I do a lot of period pieces, so men in vests actually makes a lot of sense. So I actually do have a lot of individual vests. This was one that I specifically picked up for a production of a show called Romantic Comedy by Bernard Slade. He's better known for the stage play in the movie of Same Time Next Year. But that production was also the first production where I started, where I had to dye my beard, because the show took place over a 17-year period. At the end of the period, I was the age that I am in real life. So I had to start 17 years younger. So we dyed the beard, and I was in very appropriate, and it was also period clothing. This was in the 60s and the 70s, and then going like right into the early 80s. So I had some really nice looking clothes to start out with. I start the show naked. That's another story. I ended up going into a tuxedo on stage, which I should add that to my resume. It is a skill set to be able to completely dress yourself without a mirror while carrying on a conversation with memorized lines. But regardless, as the show progresses, my life starts to fall apart, and I go from a very put together, very concerned about my appearance, a very well-dressed individual, to someone who would wear this. It's a vest that has the sleeves cut out of it. It has a snap front. It's a little snap pocket. It is not a fashion-forward statement. And so I added onto this a set of sweats and flip-flops. And my favorite story from that show is it was a theater I'd never worked at before. And the tradition was after the show, the cast would go out into the audience and meet people that had seen the show. And a gentleman who I'd never seen before and never met before ended up telling me, "Wow, who did your makeup? You looked like such crap in Act 2. It's amazing how you could do that to make it look like you let yourself go." And I had to inform him that that's me. So that's one of my favorite stories regarding theater overall. But it was the introduction of this vested jacket, and it shows up in a couple of other theater productions, typically in roles where I've let myself go, and this just seems to fill that bill. Now, depending on who you ask, what I'm wearing right now could also be indicative of someone who let themselves go. But this also has turned into one of my favorite costume pieces. To the point, I actually wear this in day-to-day life. Now, I do not wear it to work. Well, normally, I might have done it once or twice. It's significantly too large for me right now, which just makes me happy because I have lost at pretty much over 100. I had lost over 125 pounds. Unfortunately, I put some of that weight back on, but it does make me happy when I put on old clothes like this, and they're still too big, so yay. But this has these most amazing tigers on it, and this just ends up being a really fun piece that, again, when you have to consider when you're thrifting and acquiring costume pieces, the audience is typically going to be pretty far away from you. So in many cases, they're not even going to know necessarily that they're dragons, but they're going to get the idea that this is a very loud print shirt with a loud print on the back as well. Ironically, before I knew about this challenge, I was in the process of recording another video, which I haven't edited yet, but will be going up, in which I am wearing a different dragon-themed shirt that I also wore for theater productions. That video will talk about the world of theater from a broader base. It touches a little bit on how I got into thrifting. This is doing a much deeper dive. That one will go into, it does less in costumes and actually covers more in the props and the set dressing, because I did a lot of that as well. But this shirt also appears in a couple of different productions, including one of my favorites where I got to pair it with another thrifted pair of really tiny white shorts. Yeah, it was a look, and this was a production that I effectively would trip over people's feet in the audience because we were so close. The stage was so close to the audience. So they got some really close-up shots of me, but we'll leave it there. Sometimes costume pieces, particularly in men's costumes, when you're doing period pieces, it's hard to come up with something that is very specific of a specific era. Men have always worn suits. Yes, they've changed. In some cases, you would have a double-breasted versus a single-breasted. Sometimes you have a two-button. Hey, there's that era of three buttons. And again, particularly when you're dealing with community theater, audiences tend to be fairly forgiving because they recognize you don't have the Museum of the Fashion Institute of New York, in your basement. So you're making do with what you have. But one of the fun areas where you can try and make that difference is in neckties. I have a very wide variety of neckties, and all of them were typically picked up either to accent a specific color scheme. There's a concept when you're costuming characters to keep them in a specific color scheme, particularly in larger theaters, so that anytime you come on stage, if you have the same general build or appearance of it as another actor, you can become the actor in blue where that actor is the actor in beige, and people can keep straight who's who. It's a minor thing. So this graced both, I think this came in a couple of productions for both Miracle on 34th Street as well as The Man Who Came to Dinner. This one is a lot bolder, and this was a case where it needed to be seen from a distance. And so this, although no one would necessarily see that it's a lion's crest type tie, you're going to see from a distance the fact that it's blue and gold, and the gold will pop out from a blue suit. And the character, this was in a show called The Man with the Plastic Sandwich. I was the man with the plastic sandwich, and basically I had a very boring and humdrum life, and this was my attempt at being edgy, a bright tie. So little things like this can really add to community theater production, and these are so much fun to thrift at something like a Goodwill or Salvation Army, because they always have hundreds of them. You can get different widths of ties. You can get the really skinny 80s ties. Again, it's one of those cases where something that's very small and very inexpensive can really add to a lot of, you can really give a lot of credence to a period piece, to a man on stage. I'm running out of adjectives to say something is my favorite, but this probably falls under one of the most fun costume pieces I'd ever had. And maybe I qualify that by saying one of the most unintentionally fun costume pieces I ever had. I was in a production of Mamma Mia. I played Bill, one of the fathers, and I was having a little bit of an identity crisis because when you work in community theater, you have to work with the creative team and the actors and actresses that are available. And making a long story short, this production, if you're familiar with the show, all of the individuals within the show should be somewhere in the neighborhood of 40, because the daughter is turning 20, and although it's not outright stated, the underlying story is that her mother had her at a time when she was still living at home, so probably 16 to 18. So if you go based on that, everyone in the show should be somewhere in that 36 to 38, pushing 40 level. I was old enough to be every single person's father in that production. Now, not... in some cases, it would have been really close. I think the oldest person beyond me was 34. So, okay, I would have had to have her when I was 15, but it's been known to happen. So I was having an identity crisis that I felt old. I really felt old. I was literally old enough to be the father of one of the other dads. In real life, one of the dads, the dad that played Sam, was 24. I was double his age. So I really was trying to figure out what could I do to look young. So again, dyed my beard. People have no idea what my real beard color is. So I dyed my beard again, tried to look young along with everybody else, and tried to buy clothing that I felt would be appropriate for a show that took place in 1999. And I picked this up. I didn't really have any specific reason to pick it up. It just seemed like vaguely that's something I kind of remembered from the 90s and it would work. Until I was told that this is called a drug rug. And I don't know how, if that's an offensive term, so if it is, I apologize. I don't think it is. But it's one of these cases where my daughter told me that for the first time, and I just thought it was something she made up. Until I took it to the theater and everyone else saw it, and this became the drug rug for my character. It was still a fun character to play. It was a fun costume to wear. It was a fun show to do. But again, sometimes when you go thrifting, you're looking at things that end up having kind of like, well, I think that kind of matches the general era, but you don't always know the backstory. So this is my drug rug. So as I mentioned, I did my first show only a little over 4 years ago. And it was a time in my life where I joke about it being my midlife crisis, but I don't really mean it as a joke. It was a time where I was trying to figure things out. I was going through some level of a midlife crisis, and theater really filled a need for me that I didn't even know I had. And so it's for the last 4 years, it's been extremely important to me, and I've loved participating in it. Last year I changed jobs, and as a part of my new job, I'm traveling more. So I'm still able to do productions, I'm still able to act in shows, but it's becoming more and more difficult. Even though community theaters will tend to work around your schedule, they can only work around so much. At some point, they have to get the job done. So I've started directing, I've started doing more set dressing, I've started doing more with props, things that I could do even if I'm only in town for the weekend. I can run into the theater, help do all the things I need to do, and then be gone and let the actors do their job. It's difficult for me to handle because it's something I do enjoy being on stage. And in a really weird way, that's how YouTube has really started taking off, because I recognize this was a way to somewhat perform. But regardless, I was scheduled before the current pandemic really took hold to direct a production of Anti-Mame. Probably one of my favorite movies of all time, and the stage play is extremely close to the movie. Because I knew I was directing it for about 6 months or 7 months in advance, I had started sourcing costumes for my actors and actresses. I didn't even know who was going to play different roles, but if I found a piece that I felt fit in that 1920s to 1930s era that's reflective of Anti-Mame, I was going to pick it up. And this is probably one of my favorite finds. It is this green wool cape with this bright chartreuse green interior. It's far more shiny than what's coming up on the screen. It is a cape. There are no sleeves. It just has little slits right here. There's a very large medallion to use as the zipper, and there is a zipper, and then there's also these big snaps or buttons down the front. It's a Vogue Couturier design is the label. I know nothing about clothes. All the things that I resell, I do nothing with clothing. But I picked it up at a Goodwill, and I want to say it was on one of my road trips, so it was probably in Iowa or Nebraska, for $7.49. And I didn't know who was going to wear it, but I couldn't wait for someone to put this on. And because of the current pandemic, the production has been canceled. So I have stacks of vintage clothing, vintage props, all things I was going to use in my production that I now are put into storage. Maybe the show will come back to life someday. I hope it does. In the meantime, I've got a really cool cape to remind me of it. So I already just showed you women's clothing, but I explained why I had them. It was basically picking up women's clothes to put on the backs of other individuals, most likely females, to portray a very specific era on stage. But I will close this video with this piece, which was thrifted from a Goodwill, I believe, but it was definitely thrifted, that graced me. Yes, I'm a very diverse actor. Once, and only once, I have performed in drag. If you are familiar with the movie version, Some Like It Hot, there is a musical version of it called Sugar. And I played the Jack Lemmon role, so I played Daphne, and this was my shawl. And with that, we will close the I Love Thrifting collaboration video. My thanks to My Blessed Nest for suggesting this video theme. I hope you've enjoyed it. It may have given you a little bit of a different insight into me. I don't know if that's a good insight or not, but you got an insight. Again, my name is Patrick. I can be found on Trusty Huckster Mercantile. All of my social media is the abbreviation THMercantile. I'm active obviously here on YouTube, but also on Instagram, Facebook, and Etsy. If you've gotten this far into the video and you're not already a subscriber, I'd appreciate you taking into consideration and going ahead and subscribing. Particularly during this time where a lot of us are locked up into our homes, the video content that I'm putting out is fluctuating a little bit, but I really would like feedback of what people like to see, what they'd like to see more of, or maybe less of. And I will continue to build my presence on YouTube. If you're into vintage yourself, check out Etsy, check out eBay, Mercari, Poshmark. There's all kinds of platforms that are available and all kinds of sellers just like myself who are offering specifically curated items that are designed for people with a more sophisticated taste. If you're into anything, you'll be able to find it on one of those platforms. So again, thank you very much. Thanks to My Blessed Nest. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll come back and visit me sometime again soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.